All right, let's talk about a final argument for God's existence. We're only going to cover 3 of the 5 arguments in this class. We covered the cosmological argument on Thursday, the teleological argument today, and now the weirdest one of all, hardest to understand, the ontological argument. Okay, now ontology literally just means being. Okay, ontology equals being. The field of ontology is this complex subspecialty in philosophy that investigates the nature of being. What does it mean to be? Okay, what does it mean to be in this particular way? What are the characteristics of being? But the ontological argument is an argument for God's existence on the basis of being. So let me put some premises and a conclusion up here. Bear with me for just a minute while I write these out. We'll call the greatest possible being the GPB. All right, let me go over these premises one by one, and then I'll talk about some criticisms of the argument. Well, first I'll ask for clarification questions, and I'll talk about criticisms. Okay, I can imagine a greatest possible being. What is meant by a greatest possible being? Well, a being with infinite powers, infinite cognitive capacities, infinite physical capacities. Take any of the kinds of capacities that we would consider skills and maximize them as much as possible, and you get the GPB, or the greatest possible being. Now, to exist in reality is greater than to exist in the mind alone. In other words, things that have real existence are greater. That is, they are ontologically superior. In the order of being, they are superior to things that do not have real existence, things that exist in the mind alone. Let me provide you guys with a quick illustration of this. Okay, my wife is a big fan of superhero movies. She loves superhero movies. Her biggest hero is Captain America. Okay, and she tells me, after we watch these movies in the theater, we don't really do it these days, not in these COVID times, but she tells me, you know, honey, you remind me of Captain America. And I really appreciate it when she says that. I'm like, you know, I take that as a compliment, honey. But one time, she was, after we saw one of these movies, these Marvel movies, she's just going on and on and on about Captain America. And I was sick of it, right? So I said, honey, you must choose. Captain America or me, right? To which she responded, don't make me do that. Wrong response, right? You should not say that, okay, when you are asked a question of that kind, right? But in the end, she said, honey, you're real and he's not, which I appreciated. That was nice that she said that.
Wait. Like, would it
He's not real, man. Wouldn't that be cool if the Avengers were real? But he's not real, okay? He's ontologically inferior to a human being who doesn't have his powers, but who is real and has ontological superiority to the merely make-believe individual that is Captain America. Okay, you could run it with something else, right? So the classic example that the philosophers have used is Pegasus. Pegasus is a winged horse. Pegasus, being winged and able to fly, is in a certain sense greater than normal horses. But when it comes down to it in an ontological sense, horses that are real, that have real existence, are superior to Pegasus, since Pegasus is merely a figment of our imaginations. Okay, so to exist in reality is greater ontologically than to exist in the mind alone. Everybody kind of see that? It is a superior thing to have real existence than to be merely an imaginary being. Now, here we get to it. We now come down to it. If the greatest possible being did not exist in reality, that is, if the greatest possible being were merely a figment of our imaginations, then it would not be the greatest possible being. Everybody kind of track that. The reason why it would not be the greatest possible being is because there would be other beings, namely us, who do actually exist in reality and would be superior to this merely imaginary greatest possible being. So it must not be the greatest possible being, since it doesn't have all the great-making characteristics that we who do really exist actually may have. Okay, the greatest possible being therefore must exist in reality. Because if it did not exist in reality, then it would not be the greatest possible being. Therefore, it must exist in reality. Therefore, God exists. Okay, now, when people first encounter this argument, this is a very famous historical argument. It dates back thousands of years. When people first encounter this argument for God's existence, usually their first response is, wait, he can't do that. That's like a sleight of hand, isn't it? Because it feels like a sleight of hand. It feels like some sort of verbal wordplay or some sort of, assumption was smuggled in that we didn't understand, or, have I committed myself to something I wasn't expecting? I can imagine a greatest possible being to exist in reality is greater than to exist in the mind alone. If the greatest possible being did not exist in reality, then it would not be the greatest possible being. Therefore, it must exist in reality. And we will call that greatest possible being God. Therefore, God must exist. Okay, let me ask for clarification questions to make sure that we all understand this argument before I mention any criticisms. Does everybody kind of understand the moves that are being made here? Kind of?
It's like you skipped a step. It's like...
Yeah, I know. This one's a toughie.
The whole thing about faith is to believe something that's not there.
Yeah.
God, existence-wise, isn't really...
So an assumption built into the argument is that existence is a great-making property. In other words, to exist is better than not to exist. Okay, which I think most of us intuitively believe, yes? If you think that to exist is greater than not to exist, then you can buy this third premise, premise C here, that the greatest possible being, if it were not to exist in reality, would lack a great-making characteristic.
Oh, okay, so therefore it has to exist.
Therefore it must exist in reality.
Yeah.
And, like, it doesn't say anything about who the greatest possible being is. It could be Barack Obama, right? It could be Michael Jackson. Okay, who doesn't exist anymore, maybe? I guess. All right, but anyway. Okay. Right, it could be anything. This doesn't tell us what the characteristics of the greatest possible being are. It simply says that the greatest possible being must exist. Whoever or whatever the greatest possible being is, the argument says that being must exist. That's the argument.
In heaven or on earth.
In heaven, on earth, wherever.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay? It must exist because such a being would be superior to any other greatest possible being that did not exist. Because if it did not exist, then it would not be the greatest possible being.
Also, if you don't agree with premise A,
Good.
then you can't arrive at the conclusion.
Great comment. Yeah, okay, so one point of entry into the argument, one criticism is that we cannot, in fact, imagine the greatest possible being. Okay, so yes, I can imagine Superman-like characteristics. I can imagine extraordinary cognitive capacities. But it could be argued, so the critic might say, that you're just imagining finite capacities maximized as much as you can possibly think. You're not actually imagining the greatest possible being. Okay, so one criticism is that that's not possible for us to do. Okay, another criticism is that you could actually run this for any one of a variety of different things. All right, so let me give you guys a couple of examples here. Let's run it for the greatest possible quarterback, the GPQ. Who is the greatest quarterback of all time?
Tom Brady.
Probably Tom Brady, much as that pains me to say that.
Mr. Brady.
Peyton Manning, Joe Montana, probably Tom Brady.
Seven.
Can we do basketball?
That's worse.
Well, it's not LeBron. I think it's got to be Jordan.
He was the first to do it. So yeah.
I don't know. You could do it for like the GPPS, the greatest possible pop star. Who's the greatest pop star of all time?
Michael Jackson.
Katy Perry? Seriously? Oh, don't kill me.
Taylor
Taylor
Swift.
Swift? Michael Jackson? I don't know. Probably Michael Jackson,
It
right?
has to be Michael Jackson.
Yeah. I mean, like, who would be like more famous or influential than Michael Jackson? The Beatles, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, Michael Jackson.
No, not the Beatles.
Prince? Probably not Prince. But anyway, right? So definitely not Lady Gaga.
Oh,
Okay.
my God.
All right. So
What about
okay.
greatest rapper?
You could run it for the greatest possible pop star, right? I can imagine such a thing. To exist in reality is greater than to exist in the mind alone. If the greatest possible pop star did not exist in reality, then it would not be the greatest possible pop star. Therefore, the greatest possible pop star must exist in reality. Okay, you could run this argument for any one of a number of different things that seem pretty counterintuitive. Okay, and so the criticism here is that it actually doesn't arrive at a substantive conclusion for us to reference the greatest possible being. It doesn't arrive at a substantive conclusion. Instead, the argument begs the question, is the criticism here. To beg the question is to engage in a form of circular reasoning. The criticism is that the argument neglects to actually identify a being that has substance that we can grasp or understand. Okay, which is not necessarily something that's built into the argument. Okay, there's some other criticisms I could point to here. I do want to say this on behalf of this argument. I do not find this argument convincing, mostly because I don't understand it. But it is an argument that has been convincing down through the centuries, through history, to many, many, many famous philosophers who are far smarter than I am. And for that reason, it needs to be taken seriously. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, one of the most famous thinkers of all time, found this to be convincing. This was the reason he believed in God's existence, was the ontological argument. Again, more convincing for me personally are the teleological argument and also the cosmological argument, which I talked about on Thursday. Those are more convincing for me personally. But this is an argument that is taken very seriously in the philosophy of religion literature down through the centuries, and that has been convincing to countless very, very intelligent people. Okay, so just an FYI. I wouldn't be a self-respecting philosophy instructor if I didn't go through it here. Yes?
So
Telos means purpose or ends or goal.
Teleological argument was
It's like the goal or end-based argument. So in other words, the argument is saying that there was a goal or an end to creation.
okay, and then the ontological is the building.
Is being. Like the ontological argument is an argument based on the existence of being, saying that being in reality is greater than merely imaginative being. Therefore, the greatest possible being must exist.
In the other argument,
The cosmological argument is an argument from first things. Cosmology is the study of first things, right? And it is an argument for the existence of a first thing, an unmoved mover.
And this is all from Aquinas.
So Aquinas comes up with the most sophisticated, highly developed versions of the cosmological and the teleological argument. He also treats the ontological argument. Although he had a troubled relationship with the ontological argument, he didn't always buy it. He did sometimes. It was a difficult situation for him, apparently. Okay? All righty. Let's...
What about the fine-tuning argument?
The fine-tuning argument is a version of the teleological argument.
Oh,
Yes, that is a version of the argument from design, the teleological argument. Look for the PowerPoint on Blackboard, and all of this will be testable material, just FYI. Okay? But the test will not be this week, it will be the week after break.